My name is Sheikh Hassan Al-Mansouri. On March 15th, 2019, at age 45, I was clinically dead for 12 minutes after being shot outside my mosque in Detroit. For 25 years, I served as an Islamic scholar and respected imam who had memorized the entire Quran. I died a devoted Muslim and came back a follower of Jesus Christ. I know what you're thinking right now. This sounds impossible, but please stay with me, because what happened in those 12 minutes changed everything I believed about God, eternity, and truth itself. I was born in a small village outside Beirut, Lebanon, where the call to prayer echoed 5 times daily from the ancient mosque near our home. My earliest memory isn't of toys or games, but of my father's weathered hands guiding mine across the pages of the Quran, teaching me Arabic letters before I could even read English properly. When we immigrated to Detroit when I was 8 years old, that sacred book came with us, wrapped carefully in green silk. My devotion to Islam wasn't something I chose later in life. It chose me from birth. By age 12, I had memorized all 6,236 verses of the Quran. Other kids my age were playing video games, while I spent hours perfecting my recitation under the guidance of our local imam. My parents would beam with pride when visitors came to our home, and I would recite entire chapters without a single mistake. Ask yourself this question: have you ever had beliefs so deep they defined every breath you took? That was Islam for me. I would wake at 3:47 every morning, never needing an alarm clock because my soul was programmed for worship. My knees had permanent indentations from decades of prostration on my prayer rug. The rhythm of Islamic life flowed through my veins like blood itself. After high school, I traveled to Cairo to study at Al-Azhar University, one of the most prestigious Islamic institutions in the world. For 7 years, I immersed myself in Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and Arabic literature. I could debate the finer points of Sharia law in classical Arabic and had read every major Islamic commentary written in the past 1,000 years. When I returned to Michigan, the community embraced me as their scholar. At 25, I became the Imam of Masjid al-Nur in Dearborn, leading a congregation of over 800 families. For 15 years, I guided my people through marriages, divorces, deaths, and spiritual crises. I counseled over 1,000 families, always pointing them back to the 5 pillars of Islam and complete submission to Allah. My own family reflected my devotion. I had been married to Fatima for 22 years, and she was as devoted as I was. Our 3 children, Ahmed, Layla, and Omar, were all memorizing the Quran just as I had. Every evening after dinner, our home filled with the melodic sounds of Arabic recitation. But even in my most devout moments, questions stirred in my heart like whispers I couldn't silence. When Christian colleagues invited me to interfaith dialogues, I would defend Islam passionately, yet something about their peace troubled me. They spoke of knowing God personally, not just serving Him dutifully. I pushed these thoughts away, believing they were Satan's whispers, trying to lead me astray from the straight path. I had published 3 books on Islamic commentary and appeared regularly on religious panels throughout Michigan. The Muslim community respected me. The broader religious community knew me as a bridge builder and scholar. Looking back now, I see God was preparing my heart through every question, every doubt, every moment of spiritual hunger that ritual couldn't satisfy. March 15th, 2019 started like any other Tuesday in my life. I woke for Fajr prayer at 3:47 a.m., performed my ablutions with the same careful precision I had practiced for decades, and prostrated myself toward Mecca as the Detroit sky remained dark and quiet. After morning prayers and breakfast with my family, I spent the day preparing for my evening class on advanced Quran interpretation. That Tuesday evening was particularly beautiful. Spring was beginning to touch Michigan, And I remember thinking as I walked into our mosque how blessed I felt to serve Allah in such a welcoming community. The mosque was full that night with about 30 students, mostly young men eager to deepen their understanding of Islamic theology. The lesson that evening focused on Surah Maryam, the chapter about Mary, the mother of Jesus. One of my brightest students, a college sophomore named Khalil, raised his hand with a question that made my heart skip unexpectedly. He asked why the Quran spoke so reverently about Isa, Jesus, calling him the word of Allah and the spirit from Allah, yet we were taught he was merely a prophet like Muhammad. I gave the standard Islamic answer I had given hundreds of times before. Jesus was indeed a great prophet, born of a virgin, performed miracles, but he was not divine. Allah has no son. The Christians had corrupted the original message, but even as these familiar words left my mouth, something stirred uncomfortably in my chest, a whisper of doubt I couldn't name. After class ended around 8:30 p.m., I gathered my material slowly, that strange unease still lingering. I carried my well-worn Quran in a leather satchel, along with my prayer beads, gifts from my pilgrimage to Mecca 5 years earlier. Several students approached me with follow-up questions, and we chatted in the mosque's foyer for another 20 minutes. Walking to my car in the mosque parking lot, I felt peaceful again. The March air was crisp but not cold, and I could hear the distant sounds of traffic on Warren Avenue. I was thinking about preparing my Friday sermon when I heard what sounded like a car backfiring across the street. But it wasn't a car. Gang violence had erupted near the convenience store directly across from our mosque property. I turned toward the sound just as more gunshots rang out. In that split second, I realized I was caught in the crossfire of something that had nothing to do with me or my faith. The first bullet struck my chest with the force of a sledgehammer, spinning me around and sending my Quran flying from my hands. The second bullet tore through my abdomen as I was falling. I hit the asphalt hard, my white thobe immediately soaking with blood. My prayer beads scattered across the parking lot like black pearls. Have you ever been in a moment where normal life became impossible in a heartbeat? Where everything you planned for tomorrow suddenly became meaningless? I could hear shouting, car doors slamming, engines racing away. Someone from inside the mosque was screaming my name. The pain was beyond description. I tried to breathe, but my lungs were filling with blood. With my last conscious strength, I whispered the Shahada. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. I repeated it over and over as my vision blurred, and the voices around me grew distant. Then the pain stopped completely. Everything went silent. The silence was absolute, but I was still conscious. More conscious than I had ever been in my physical life. I found myself floating about 10 feet above my own body, watching paramedics work frantically over what looked like a broken doll in blood-soaked white robes. The scene below seemed surreal. Like watching a movie of someone else's tragedy, I could see everything with perfect clarity. My Quran lay open beside my body, its pages fluttering in the evening breeze, some stained with my blood. The prayer beads I had carried for 15 years were scattered across the asphalt in a wide arc. 2 paramedics were cutting away my thobe, while a third pressed something against my chest wounds. Their lips were moving urgently, but I heard no sound. Brother Mahmoud from our mosque was pacing nearby, speaking rapidly into his phone. I watched him call my wife, and even from my elevated position, I could see his hands trembling as he tried to find the right words. Within minutes, cars began arriving. My mosque family poured out onto the parking lot, forming a circle around the ambulance, their hands raised in prayer. Then I saw Fatima arrive. My heart, wherever it was in this strange new existence, broke as I watched her run toward my lifeless body. She fell to her knees beside the stretcher, her hijab askew, reaching out to touch my face. I wanted desperately to comfort her, to tell her I could see everything, that I was somehow still there. But I couldn't make any connection with the physical world below. As the ambulance pulled away with my body inside, I felt myself being drawn away from the earthly scene. It wasn't like the bright tunnel that people often describe in near-death experiences. Instead, I moved through what felt like layers of consciousness, each one taking me further from everything familiar. I expected to hear the call to prayer echoing from paradise. I expected to see the gardens and flowing rivers described in the Quran. I had preached about these rewards for 25 years, had comforted dying believers with promises of eternal bliss for the faithful. Where was the welcome I had been promised? Instead, I found myself in a realm of profound spiritual silence, not the peaceful silence of meditation, but an unsettling emptiness that made me feel more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. I called out in Arabic, "Allah, Allah, I served you faithfully for 45 years. My voice seemed to disappear into an endless void. For the first time since childhood, I felt genuine terror. Not the fear of earthly dangers, but a deep spiritual dread that shook the very core of my being. I had been so certain about my relationship with Allah, so confident in my theology and devotion. Yet here I was, seemingly abandoned in a place that felt nothing like the paradise I had studied and taught about. Images from my life began flashing before me, but not in chronological order. I saw moments of sincere worship, hours spent in prayer and study, acts of charity and community service. But I also saw something else, moments when my heart had questioned, when I had sensed there might be more to spiritual truth than what I had been taught. I'm asking you to imagine your deepest, most certain beliefs being challenged in a realm where you can't argue or explain away what you're experiencing. That's exactly where I found myself, suspended between life and death, between everything I had believed and a growing realization that my understanding had been incomplete. Through that terrifying spiritual darkness, a light began approaching. But this wasn't the harsh, blinding light you might imagine. It was warm and inviting, like the glow of a hearth fire that promises comfort to a traveler lost in winter. As it drew closer, I felt something I hadn't experienced since entering this realm: hope. Within that light, a figure emerged. He was a man of Middle Eastern appearance, wearing simple robes that seemed to shimmer with their own radiance. His hair was dark and his beard neatly trimmed, but what captured my attention immediately were his hands. I could see wounds there, and similar wounds on his feet. My Islamic training immediately screamed that this couldn't be real. Without speaking audibly, he communicated directly to my heart in a way that bypassed all language barriers. "Hassan," he said, though his lips didn't move, "I am the one you have been seeking all your life." The voice carried an authority I had never encountered, mixed with a tenderness that made me want to weep. Every fiber of my being wanted to reject what I was seeing. For 25 years, I had taught that Jesus was merely a prophet, not divine, certainly not the Son of God. The Quran was clear: Allah has no son. I had debated Christians countless times on this very point. Yet here before me stood someone claiming to be exactly what my theology said was impossible. "You cannot be Jesus," I protested. "Jesus was just a prophet, a messenger like Muhammad. Allah is one, indivisible. He has no partners, no son." Even in this spiritual realm, my doctrinal training kicked in automatically. The figure smiled with infinite patience. "Hassan, your heart was sincere, but you were worshipping me through a veil. Every time you honored Isa in the Quran, every time you spoke of the word of Allah and the spirit from Allah, you were speaking of me. but the full revelation was hidden from you. He began showing me things that challenged everything I had believed. I saw the Old Testament prophecies I had dismissed, now blazing with meaning. Isaiah 53, Daniel's prophecies, the Psalms that spoke of a suffering Messiah. He showed me how the Quran itself testified to his uniqueness among all prophets, how it alone called him the word of Allah. Look at your own studies, Hassan, he said gently. When you read that I was born of a virgin, that I spoke from the cradle, that I created birds from clay and breathed life into them, that I healed the blind and raised the dead, did your heart never wonder why no other prophet was given these signs? The questions that had plagued me for years suddenly made sense. Those weren't satanic whispers trying to lead me astray. They were his spirit drawing me toward truth. The discomfort I felt when Christians spoke of knowing God personally wasn't theological error on their part. It was my own heart recognizing something authentic that I lacked. But what overwhelmed me most wasn't the theological revelation. It was the love. I had preached about Allah's mercy for decades, had studied the 99 beautiful names of God, had taught about divine compassion. But I had never felt love like this. It was unconditional, complete, and personal in a way that made me understand that this being knew every thought I had ever had, every secret prayer, every moment of doubt and seeking. I know about your questions regarding the fate of sincere non-Muslims, he said, addressing one of my deepest theological struggles. I know about your secret prayers, asking why good people who weren't born into Islam would face eternal punishment. Your compassion reflected mine. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself, is there a longing that no amount of religious activity has ever satisfied? Standing before this figure, I realized that empty space in my soul had always been Jesus-shaped, and no amount of Islamic devotion could fill it because it was designed for him alone. As I stood before Jesus, overwhelmed by his love and the weight of these revelations, he presented me with a choice that would change everything. Hassan, he said, his voice carrying both gentleness and gravity, you can continue with me to paradise, or you can return to your earthly life. But if you return, you will carry a mission that will cost you dearly. The implications hit me like a physical blow. I understood immediately what returning would mean. My position as imam would be gone the moment I shared this testimony. My family might disown me. The community that had respected and loved me for decades would call me apostate, traitor, mentally ill. Death threats would follow. Financial ruin was certain. Your people need to hear this truth, Jesus continued, especially those who are seeking as you were seeking. You spent 45 years learning to understand the Muslim heart, studying Islamic theology, earning the trust of your community. I can use all of that for my glory now. Have you ever received a truth so powerful that you knew sharing it would cost you everything you held dear? That's the position I found myself in, suspended between two worlds, faced with a choice between personal peace and a mission that promised suffering. But something extraordinary happened as I wrestled with this decision. Jesus showed me glimpses of what my testimony could accomplish. I saw other Muslims, sincere seekers like I had been, who would find their way to him through my story. I saw bridges being built between Christians and Muslims, understanding replacing fear and suspicion. I saw the unique role I could play, speaking both languages, understanding both worldviews. Jesus, I said, surprising myself with my boldness. If I return, will you be with me through the persecution that will surely come? His response came not in words, but as an infusion of supernatural strength and peace that penetrated every fiber of my spiritual being. I knew he would never leave me. With a mixture of fear and determination, I accepted the mission. Use my life, my knowledge, my experience for your kingdom, I prayed. Let the 45 years I spent studying Islam become a bridge to lead others to you. The return to my physical body was violent and shocking. One moment I was in that realm of spiritual communion. The next I was slammed back into flesh and bone with excruciating force. The pain from my gunshot wounds crashed over me like a tsunami. Machines were beeping frantically around me, and I could hear the urgent voices of medical staff. My eyes opened in a hospital room to see my wife Fatima sitting beside my bed, her face streaked with tears, her hand gripping mine. Alhamdulillah, she whispered when she saw me awake. Praise be to Allah, you've returned to us. If only she knew what I had returned with. The doctors were calling my recovery miraculous. I had been clinically dead for 12 minutes, had lost massive amounts of blood, yet here I was, conscious and healing at a rate that astounded the medical team. But the real miracle wasn't my physical healing. It was the complete transformation of my spiritual understanding. In those first hours back in my body, I found myself unable to pray in Arabic as I had for decades. When I tried to recite familiar Quranic verses, they felt empty, like echoes of someone else's words. Instead, I found myself whispering, Jesus, help me understand how to live with this truth. The internal struggle was intense. Part of me wondered if the experience had been a hallucination brought on by blood loss and trauma. But every time doubt crept in, I would remember his face, feel again that overwhelming love, and know beyond question that what I had experienced was more real than anything in my physical life. 3 days later, still recovering in the hospital, I asked Fatima to bring me a Bible. 3 months after my encounter with Jesus, I knew I could no longer keep this truth to myself. The weight of what I had experienced pressed on my heart every day as I watched my congregation worship with the same sincere devotion I once had, yet missing the fullness of God's revelation. I called a meeting with the mosque's board of directors on a humid June evening. I can still remember the silence in that room when I finished sharing my testimony. For what felt like an eternity, 7 men who had been my closest friends and colleagues just stared at me. Then Brother Abdullah, who had known me for 15 years, exploded. This is blasphemy. You have lost your mind from the trauma. The others quickly joined in, their voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief, anger, and accusations. Within 24 hours, I was stripped of my position as imam. The mosque's board issued a statement saying I was suffering from post-traumatic stress and was no longer fit for religious leadership. They urged the community to pray for my mental recovery and to disregard anything I might say about my experience. But that was only the beginning. My own brother Rashid, who had been my closest confidant since childhood, came to my house the next day, with tears streaming down his face. Hassan, he said, you died in that parking lot. What came back is not my brother, but some kind of demon wearing his face. Those words cut deeper than any physical wound I had ever received. The financial consequences came swiftly. No Islamic organization would hire me. Muslim families who had sought my counseling for years suddenly wanted nothing to do with me. Death threats began arriving in my mailbox and through phone calls at all hours of the night. Someone spray-painted apostate across my front door in red letters. The most painful loss was my family. Fatima, my wife of 22 years, tried to be supportive at first, but the pressure from her family and the community became overwhelming. Our children, Ahmed, Layla, and Omar, faced ridicule at school and in their Islamic studies classes. Layla came home crying one day because her best friend's mother had forbidden their daughter from playing with the apostate's child. 6 months after my testimony went public, Fatima took our children and moved back to her parents' house. I cannot be married to someone who has rejected Islam, she said through her tears. You have chosen Jesus over your family. The divorce papers arrived 2 weeks later. Yet even in the midst of losing everything, I experienced a peace that surpassed all understanding. When I woke up alone in my empty house, I would pray to Jesus in the same rhythm I had once prayed to Allah. 5 times a day, I would kneel and pour out my heart to the one who had revealed himself to me. The loneliness was crushing, but his presence was undeniable. Unexpectedly, support came from the Christian community. Pastor Michael from the Methodist Church down the street knocked on my door one evening with a casserole and an invitation to share my story with his congregation. That first speaking engagement led to others. Churches across Michigan invited me to share how God had revealed himself to a Muslim scholar. More importantly, former Muslims began reaching out to me in secret. Emails arrived from around the country, from people who had left Islam and found Christ, but had no one who understood their journey. Phone calls came at midnight from seekers who were afraid to question their faith openly, but desperately needed someone who spoke their spiritual language. I realized God's purpose in allowing me 45 years of deep Islamic study. I could reach Muslims in ways that born Christians never could. When I quoted the Quran and showed how it testified to Jesus' uniqueness, they listened because I had walked their path. When I explained the theological questions that had tormented me, they recognized their own struggles. Today, 3 years after my death and resurrection, I live modestly but purposefully. I counsel former Muslims who face the same rejection I experienced. I speak at churches and universities about building bridges between Christian and Islamic communities. I still study Arabic scriptures daily, but now I see Jesus on every page. So I'm asking you, just as a former imam who met Jesus would ask, isn't it worth investigating whether the God you seek might be calling you to something greater than you've ever imagined? Truth isn't about winning religious arguments or defending the faith we inherited. It's about finding the God who loves you enough to die for you. I lost everything when I died, but I gained eternal life, perfect peace, and a purpose beyond my wildest dreams. That's a trade I would make 1,000 times over.